Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second part of Chapter 3, the Federal System. In last video lecture, we covered the powers of the national government. And in this lecture, we're going to cover the limitations on the national government, reserved powers of the states, concurrent powers, limitations on the states, and interstate regulations. I want to use in this lecture the contemporary event that we're going through to understand and illustrate how federalism actually works and how it is a complex system to understand. So let us start with our news of the pandemic that we're going through now, and we'll start our conversation.
Virus news is grim. We are now north of 53,000 cases in this country. The U.S. has found a way to lead the world yet again. Sadly, that's us at the top in red, the highest trend line of new cases. As the Financial Times put it today, we continue to set the pace. It's still true that we have no idea how many Americans have this virus because not enough Americans can get tested. It's also true that testing depends most on where you live and how much money you have. New York is now at the center of this outbreak in this country with more than 25,000 cases. Today, Governor Andrew Cuomo revealed the case count is now doubling every 3 days. He laid out in stark terms exactly what that means.
We haven't flattened the curve, and the curve is actually increasing. The apex is higher than we thought, and the apex is sooner than we thought. That is a bad combination of facts. New York is the canary in the coal mine. New York is going first. We have the highest and the fastest rate of infection. What happens to New York is going to wind up happening to California and Washington State and Illinois. It's just a matter of time. We are just a test case. And that's how the nation should look at it. Look at us today. Where we are today, you will be in 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 5 weeks or 6 weeks. We are your future.
Now look at
the governor of New York, and this afternoon the president and the vice president offered up their own warnings about America's largest city.
And it certainly is by far the, if you call it hot, if you call it any word you want to use, it's a level that no place else is close.
Reality is the New York metro area was 60% of the new cases. If you're in the New York City metropolitan area or elsewhere, to take the guidelines that we issued and avoid non-essential travel.
Now, the advice from the two leading health officials on the White House task force was even more blunt, including this request to anyone who recently left New York City because of the coronavirus.
Everybody who was in New York should be self-quarantining for the next 14 days to ensure that the virus doesn't spread to others, no matter where they have gone, whether it's Florida, North Carolina, or out to far reaches of Long Island. We are starting to see new cases across Long Island that suggest people have left the city.
What we're seeing now is that understandably, people want to get out of New York. If you look at the statistics, it's disturbing. About 1 per 1,000 of these individuals are infected. That's about 8 to 10 times more than in other areas, which means when they go to another place, for their own safety, they've got to be careful, monitor themselves.
Meanwhile, as you well know, as we've been covering, medical supplies are getting scarce all across our country. New York's mayor predicts the city of New York could run out of ventilators in just weeks. The shortages prompted a fresh round of claims and counterclaims today between the president and the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo.
FEMA is sending us 400 ventilators. These are on the news this morning. We are sending 400 ventilators to New York. 400 ventilators? I need 30,000 ventilators. You want a pat on the back for sending 400 ventilators? What are we going to do with 400 ventilators when we need 30,000 ventilators? You're missing the magnitude of the problem, and the problem is defined by the magnitude.
We're there to help them. They have to get that gear themselves. We're there to help them. If they don't have, like with Governor Cuomo, he had a chance to order 16,000 ventilators 2 years ago, and he turned it down. He turned down the chance. Now, he can't be blaming us, but we're there to help them.
Quick fact check here from our own Ken Delanian. The purchase of 15,000 ventilators, the mentioned there, was not a recommendation. In fact, the so-called shortfall the president's talking about was based on a state task force report based on a model that used the 1918 so-called Spanish flu as its basis. This afternoon, the White House announced 4,000 ventilators are now on their way to New York, and other emergency supplies are being shipped, as they continue to say, every day around the country. Federal and state officials are also monitoring spikes in cases across the country. New Orleans is seeing a rapid rise of infections. Indeed, according to the governor, the state of Louisiana is the leading hotspot right now in the world.
Now let us understand what is going on. What's going on? First, the governor of the state diagnoses the problem and tells us and make an assessment of what New York is facing and how to go about facing this problem. The pandemic, hurricane, natural disasters are things are above the state capacity to deal with. And this is the moment where the state government reaches for the federal government and tell the federal government to help the state. Now, part of the us-them discussion that is taking place and the blame that is going on right now between the federal government and the state is that the Constitution is not clear exactly on the role of the national government in natural disasters. There isn't a stated role clearly that defines what the national government is supposed to do in the Constitution of the United States in case of disaster that takes place in the states. So in the design of the Constitution, and then the governor usually is the one who's responsible for the safety and the health of the citizens of the state, as the 10th Amendment Reservation Clause. And the governor of the state determined the magnitude of the problem that is facing the state and the capacity and capability of the state of facing and dealing with this problem. And if the state cannot handle this problem, the state will reach out to the national government, and the national government with its capacity, having the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the FEMA agency, and the Center of Disease Control, the CDS. In our case now, they are supposed to step in and help the state because the state itself cannot deal with this problem. In the past, the national troops were mobilized in cases of disaster, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, and so on and so forth. In this case, the governor of the state of New York, Governor Cuomo, had asked for the logistics that the United States Army has in terms of transportation, plane lifting, mobilizing trucks from one place to another, building hospitals, and so on and so forth to face this problem. And the national government is not responding according to their frustration that you saw on the face and the words that Governor Cuomo has been saying. And the national government, the President Trump is saying that we have done all what is necessary help from us. There are certain things that the state is responsible for. This is when he claimed that, that the state of New York should have asked for all of these ventilations before. And in this case, the blame is going to go around until the national government is going to step in, because obviously the state is not going to be able to do that and is not going to be able to control the COVID-19 pandemic until the national government steps in. This is a very good example that tells us the context today when we're talking about federalism in a big problem like what is facing New York today. What is federalism? How federal relationship between the state and the national government goes about. In times, it is harmonious and it's smooth. In times, it is a tug of war. But historically, it's not clear. So if you look at past disasters, the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871 that destroyed a sizable part of the city of Chicago itself, the national government, all of these agencies were not, FEMA did not exist at that time. And certainly the size of the national government was not big enough to deal with the problem of Chicago. Most of the things were done at the state level. Most of the measures that are facing disasters were done at the state level. They were inadequate, that's true, that's why the disasters are so large, but national government did not step in this case and play the major role that we Americans expect from the national today. Another example is the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, which destroyed a huge part of the city, not only because of the earthquake itself, but because of the fire that actually spread very quickly after the earthquake due to the wooden structure of the houses in the city and inadequate fire department that deals with this problem. And you can see that 100,000 people in San Francisco were homeless, and 300,000 people 100,000 people were dead, I'm sorry, but 300,000 people were homeless. And look at the subtitle under the homelessness is that Portland, the city of Portland, is the capital, the city of Portland is going to send food and money for the district. Portland, not Washington, D.C. What does that say? It says that historically, something happened in our history in the relationship between the federal government and the national government that we come to expect these things from the services and the role of government that it plays in terms of in cases of national disaster. Now, this case and the huge shift historically happened during Great Depression of the United States and World War II. Present during that time, the stock market crashed on his watch, President Hoover, and his response was not inadequate because he responded by not interfering in the economy, but not actually doing something that actually is going to remedy the problem. And let's watch.
We shall see the break of dawn of a better day. I shall have done my part in the world.
They used to tell me I was building a dream, and so I followed them on. When there was earth to plow or guns to bear, I was always there, right on the job. They used to tell me I was building a dream, with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line, just waiting for bread?
You can see Americans, the size of the
Once
economy,
I built a railroad,
people were homeless.
I made it run,
a sizable people of Americans who
made it race against
the housemates
time. Once
boxes
I built a
cardboards,
railroad,
so on and so forth.
now it's done.
They were not receiving
Brother,
and the states were unable.
Once I built a tower,
the power to
up to the
restart the
sun,
economy or
brick
do anything.
and rivet and
That's
lime.
what people do. Size of
Once I built a tower,
long lines for jobs that
now it's
are
done.
not there, and government
Brother,
provides
can you spare a
the food for
dime?
them. This is a famous song about the Great Depression. Being Crosby, brother, can you spare a dime? So what happened? What happened in the Great Depression? I think the Great Depression is a good part of your history because the modern presidency or the modern relation of federalism played a big role in how it is shaped. And I think it's a good thing to understand what happened.
The year is 1918, and after 4 years of conflict, the First World War is finally over. America has emerged as one of the victors and is about to enter a period of economic prosperity and cultural change known as the Roaring '20s. Things start off pretty strongly as the post-war economy is seeing a boost. Troops are back from the war, delayed projects are starting up again, and hey, more women are entering the workforce, meaning that more people have a salary to spend, and companies are looking for a piece of the money pie. So in 1920, we see our first radio advertisement, and it seems to be working. Recent inventions like the vacuum cleaner and the electric washing machine are becoming hot commodities. And hey, since things are looking pretty good, the banks are giving out loans to everybody, meaning that even more people can buy the latest and greatest gadgets. Before you know it, everyone's getting a car too, Henry Ford's T model to be exact, and with it, life is becoming a lot easier. Now you can do the Charleston across town and be home for your evening smoke. All of this is making companies very rich, and the average American is making good money themselves. In fact, people are starting to look for things to do with their newfound wealth. Buy another laundry machine? Nah. A new car? Don't need it. Oh, wait, what about investing? Yeah, that's it. After all, why be rich when you can be more rich? So the stock market becomes a pretty popular practice, and with so many people buying, investors are finding it very easy to make money on stocks. Soon enough, everyone thinks they're 1920s Warren Buffett, and I mean everybody. Cooks, shoe shines, taxi drivers, you name it, everyone is trading like a Wall Street tycoon, pouring their life savings into whatever security is hot that day. In fact, there's so much money to be made, people are taking out loans to invest even more, and banks are happily collecting the interest. By the way, those same banks are looking to invest more money too, and soon enough they begin borrowing money from customer bank accounts to buy stocks. But since things are looking up, no one's noticing, and overall things are going pretty well in America, financially anyway, and as we experience flapper culture, prohibition, and the rise of jazz music, people are making good money on the markets. By 1929, America's total wealth has doubled, and investments are up 218% since 1922. In fact, stocks are rising so fast, companies are having a hard time keeping up and justifying their stock price. Wait, that's not good. And hold on, production actually seems to be slowing down. Henry's not making as many T models, and people aren't buying as many things. It looks like companies may have overestimated their growth, and now wages are falling. And all that easy to access debt? Well, people have taken out quite a bit, and interest rates are starting to rise. But wait a minute, the stock market is still up. That doesn't seem right. Even though the economy is looking worse for wear under the hood, investors are more or less ignoring these problems and buying and selling as if everything were exceptional. Sure, we see a few shakeups and close calls, but things are still largely positive, and people are still gambling on the markets. But over time, the voice of reason is getting louder, and investor uncertainty is increasing, which brings us to October 24th, 1929. Black Thursday, as it's called, the theorized start of the Great Depression. Investors have been royally spooked with headlines reading,
"Prices of stocks crash in heavy liquidation."
And when markets open, they start to sell. And I mean sell. 12.9 million shares to be exact. A new record. And at opening bell, things fall 11%. People are selling so much that price tickers can't keep up with the volume. So people don't even know what their selling price is. And all of this selling is dragging the stock market down, erasing large chunks of America's wealth. And things are about to get worse. While markets recover later that day, come Black Tuesday, it's an outright panic. The Dow Jones falls 12%, and that record we set last Thursday, yeah, we just broke it again. The markets lose $14 billion in one day. Some shares are now worthless, people have lost their life savings, and Americans who borrow to invest are absolutely crushed. And so, friends, here we are. The Great Depression, the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world. The Dow Jones falls for another 3 years after this, losing 90% of its value from its high in 1929. Many lose their jobs as companies shut down, and it's not just investors that are hit. Remember that money the banks borrowed? Well, a bunch of it is lost in the markets too, and people are only getting back 10 cents for every dollar they had in their account. Banks across the country shut down, and unemployment reaches its highest level in U.S. history, 24.9%. By this point, breadlines, soup kitchens, and homelessness are common sights. Whether you invested, borrowed money, or even just held money in a bank account, the Depression found a way to hurt you financially. Times would be tough throughout the 1930s, and fiscal intervention from Franklin D. Roosevelt would do little to boost activity. In fact, it wouldn't be until the rise of the Third Reich in Germany that we would see an end to the crisis. You see, the Great Depression wasn't just felt in America. Rather, with recent globalization, its effects were felt around the world. And in the darkness, we saw the rise of Hitler, who used the despair of the German people as a rallying call, ultimately leading to the creation of the Nazi Party and the start of the Second World War in 1939. The war created jobs in America, ironically ending one tragedy with the start of another. Experts can't agree on why the Great Depression was as bad as it was, but there were valuable takeaways from the hardship. It demonstrated just how powerful the greed and alternatively the fear of the markets can be when they get out of control, while demonstrating the destructive potential of speculation and debt. Laws would later be introduced to safeguard financial institutions and deposits. And during his time in office, Franklin D. Roosevelt would introduce the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Securities Exchange Commission, institutions targeted at protecting the wealth of Americans that still exist to this day. Few are left who remember the hardships of the Depression, but we'd be foolish to forget the lessons it provided. After all, fear, greed, and speculation are far from dead.
So World War I and the Great Depression have created all of these programs at the national level that deal with the problem that the state themselves were unable to deal with them and have no resources to deal with them. It was the size of the national government, the double side, the Social Security Act, the Unemployment Act, all of the things that we take for granted today, they did not exist prior to the Great Depression. And certainly, if we look today, who is the father of the modern presidency, we look at Franklin D. Roosevelt. He is the one who created the United States government that we recognize today, with all its role that it plays in our life. And all of these agencies, as soon as they start to be created, they mushroomed into more and more and more agencies because they were expected to play that role that the states themselves were not able to do so.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of...
One has to imagine millions of people clustered around their radio sets in towns all across the country. They don't know what to expect of this new president. He's not shown them much yet.
So help me God.
And then they hear, coming through their loudspeakers, this voice.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
So filled with courage, with self-confidence, with a sense of leadership.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper.
Suddenly this man came in and he made clear to the country that there was really nothing to fear except the fear that was in one's own heart.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
The country was so excited that one had a live leader, finally, at long last, in the White House, that he could have suggested we all get ready to walk to the moon, and we would have followed him. It was just an unbelievable change in mood.
The unbelievable change of mood because of a leader in moment of crisis. What does that remind you with? Chapter 1. Where are the sources of legitimacy that we have? In a sense that what Max Weber told us, that, charismatic authority, this is the moment of crisis where you have charismatic leader that comes and talks to the American people and has a magical powers. The ideas that President FDR was able to communicate to the American people and restore faith and confidence in the American people, even though, as you saw from the short video, Bayo, that the Great Depression, the FDR programs did not help actually the U.S. economy. It was the war, main likely, and it's still hotly debated today. But the charismatic authority itself, as we saw in George Washington, for example, when he took 2 terms in his presidency, George Washington actually created a tradition that people followed out of this. So, for example, the anger that Americans may have against the federal government in time of crisis, that the federal government is not responding, it came out of tradition. There is nothing in the Constitution to hold the federal government legally responsible for for its reaction to economic or natural disasters in the states themselves. But once FDR had created this massive state that is responsible for the American people and the program that help American people and the American economy, all presidents, when they run for re-election, they're supposed to tell you their view about the economy. Well, that was traditionally not the role of the president of the United States to talk about the economy. It was the job of Congress historically. So that traditional authority, once the programs and the departments were creating, like the social, the FEMA and the CDC and so on, they became legal. These things created laws, and these laws became part of the executive branch and executive order. And the Congress of the United States kept on creating these bureaucracies that the President of the United States needs to carry out his agenda to look after the welfare and the security of the American people within the states. So certainly it's an evolution relationship that we look at in terms of what is happening to us in the state of New York with this COVID-19 pandemic. Historically, if you look at the cabinet of President Abraham Lincoln, well, it's small. The size of bureaucracy is very small. And it kept growing and growing. You look at President Reagan and President Donald Trump. Today, if you think of it, 2.6 million people work in the government of the United States, the federal government of the United States, as a part of bureaucracy, doing what? Running all of these programs that were created during the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which is the welfare state as we know it today. And as such, the relationship of the federal government and the states cannot be understood solely by looking at the Constitution of the United States. Certainly, the Constitution is very important, but you cannot understand it except with this evolution of a real life events that change how we look at the Constitution and how we look at the role of the government. The Constitution is very clear. It gives delegated powers. That means clearly stated powers to the government of the United States. And those stated powers have implied power. If you remember the elastic clause in Article 1, at the end of Article 1, Section 8, tells us clearly that the government has powers to forgo these powers. And the Supreme Court of the United States used the elastic clause in Article 1, Section 8 for the first time in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. And in that sense, the article talked about the necessity, since the United States coins money, the necessity for the United States to create the Bank of America, even though it's not delegated the word to create a bank. And the supremacy clause of the Constitution of the United States is very important to remember that we have in the United States today at the federal level. There's one constitution called the Constitution of the United States and 50 constitutions in every state. That federal constitution is the supreme above all the other 50. So if you look at Article 6 of the Constitution, it says that the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. This Constitution, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. That means there's nothing above it. This is totally opposite, if you remember, from the Articles of Confederation in Chapter 2. Articles of Confederation, that supremacy was within the states themselves. Now the supremacy is with the national government. Add to it Article 1, Section 8, delegated power. Okay. Between parentheses, we have to remember delegated power. The United States has supremacy only in these delegated powers that are given by the Constitution of the United States. What is stated there. And the implied power in the elastic clause that goes in the area of these power that are delegated. The states have their own powers, but the states also are limited by the United States Constitution. For example, Article 1, Section 9 lists, for example, certain rights that the American people have that the states cannot pass laws and prohibit them to the American people. And remember, during the debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, the Federalists claimed that there are enough protections in Article 1, Section 9 that protects the liberties of the American people that we don't need a Bill of Rights. But of course, the debate went on, and then the agreement on passing the Bill of Rights was very important for, as a result of the debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So the first thing that is prohibited to the states, no states shall pass a bill of attainder, a bill that name a group of people. When you say this is the Catholic law, this is the Muslim law, this is the communist law, this is the socialist law. You cannot name a group of people and pass them. Laws have to be applied to all the people equally, across the board. The second one is ex post facto laws. You cannot apply punishment of a law before the fact, after the fact. So you cannot go in the past and apply the punishment, for example, of a law that you passed today. Let's look at, for example, recreation cannabis. It is passed in state of Colorado, let's say, for example. Let's say, for example, the United States government passed a law, or the state passed a law, and the state is going to go back and punish and put people in jail or fine those people who used to have shops selling legal cannabis when it was legal. That you cannot do. All laws have to be applied in the future cases. You cannot go backward to protect people from being targeted by the government of the United States or the states. You cannot also suspend, states cannot also suspend the writ of habeas corpus, the right of people or the accused to cross-examine the evidence presented against them in any case. Maybe today this seems like intuitive, but when the Constitution was drafted, many parts of the world had no writ of habeas corpus. So people were thrown in jail without knowing why they were thrown in jail. Among them, Dostoevsky, the great literator, a Russian literator, who was thrown in jail and he did not know what was his charge until he was released later on. And in that sense, if you look at, it's a pioneering principle to put in Article 1, Section 9, that these rights are not going to be limitation on the national government. The national government cannot take those away from the states, from the citizens of the United States. Reserved powers. This is powers that are given to the reserved to the state governments. And in that sense, the 10th Amendment states clearly that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Congress nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What does that mean? That means the 10th Amendment says that whatever not mentioned in the Constitution of the United States, not delegated to the national power, not an area of delegated national power, the national government cannot actually use these areas that are not mentioned, delegated in the Constitution, and claim supremacy on them. What are these areas? Okay, so health, for example. This is precisely why I started the chapter with Governor Cuomo of the state of New York, who is talking and in the battle on the ground in combating the pandemic that the state of New York is facing. Welfare of the people, safety. Most of the policing that takes place in your life is a state policing, not federal policing, and state policing that is passing state law more than federal law that is passing by the Congress of the United States for policing morals of the citizens. This is precisely why, for example, some states you found, like Nevada, for example, where gambling is legal, and some other states, for example, gambling is illegal. States, however, do not have the authority over the area that are assigned to the national government. What are these areas, for example? Commerce. States cannot, for example, print money. States cannot, for example, enter into a commerce treaty with a foreign nation. All of these powers were given to delegated to the national government, and therefore they are prohibited to the states. Concurrent powers are powers that are shared by the national government and the states. What are they? Concurrent powers like, for example, taxing. Incorporation, creating a corporation. Establishing courts. Of course, we have federal courts and state courts and two court system, yet since the supremacy clause is stated in Article 6 in the Constitution of the United States, the Supreme Court of the United States and the Constitution of the United States are above the 50 states. And in that sense, the Constitution of the United States and the Supreme Court of the United States can invalidate any law in the state constitution that runs afoul with the federal constitution or Constitution of the United States. And also eminent domain the taking of somebody's property, private property, for public use. Limitations on the states. Article 1, Section 10 tells us that states cannot do certain things. For example, a state may not enter into a treaty, coin money, interfere, or with contractual obligation with another state, or grant titles of nobility. We cannot put, for example, king or monarch or so on and so forth. So those are clear in the Constitution of the United States. Also, through judicial interpretation, the due process of the law of the 14th Amendment of the Supreme Court of the United States has applied to provisions of the Bill of Rights against the states. So, for example, the right to counsel. Some states in their constitution wasn't there a right to counsel. For example, if you can't afford a lawyer, then too bad. You have to go to court, stand and defend yourself by yourself. This is the famous, as we're going to see in the chapter of civil liberties in Gideon versus Wainwright. So most of the civil liberties that Americans have, they are based on the due process clause in the Constitution of the United States and the 14th Amendment. While the equal protection of the law, these are the civil rights of American people against their state and national government. So the right to speech is the due process of the law. The right to be treated equally is the equal protection of the law under the 14th Amendment. Those are the states cannot. So even though, if you look in our history, okay, I'll let this pass. Even if we look at our history, when we see, for example, Jim Crow laws, laws that run clearly afoul with the equal protection of the law and the Constitution of the United States, the Supreme Court of the United States decided to look the other way when dealing with this issue, and instead of calling these cases, the Supreme Court stalled its role to actually hold the states to this standard. Meanwhile, when the Supreme Court of the United States was active, Brown versus the Board of Education had ended such segregations.